Hey, welcome to Lesson 6 about Native American migration across North America and European interaction with Native American tribes, specifically focusing on Missouri. There's a lot we're going to try to cover in this lesson. Native American studies will go into next week as well. If you hear some snoring in the background, I apologize. James is sleeping and the dogs are sleeping as well. But we're going to get back to our book, A River Ran Wild, and we are going to read the second part. Now, if you remember yesterday, the Native Americans had their first interaction with a pale-skinned trader who came with a boatload full of treasures, and he brought shiny metal knives, colored beads, cooking kettles, different things for them to trade together. And the Nashaway welcomed him, traded furs, and they set up a trading post together on the Nashaway River, in that Nashaway River Valley. Let's see what happens next. In the many years that followed, the settlers' village and others like it grew, and the Nashaway became the Nashua. The settlers worked together to clear land by cutting down the forests, which they thought were full of danger, wilderness that they would conquer. They hunted wolves and beaver, killing much more than they needed. Extra pelts were sent to England in return for goods and money. The settlers built sawmills along the river, which the Nashua's current powered. They built dams to make the mill ponds that were used to store the water. They cut down the towering forest and floated tree trunks down the river. The logs were cut up into lumber, which was used for building houses. So I want you to notice how the settlers interact with the land the Native Americans were living in and how that changes the river. The settlers built fences for their pastures, plowed the fields, and planted crops. They called the land their own and told the Indians not to trespass. Hunting land disappeared as the settlers cleared the forest. Indian fishing rights vanished as the settlers claimed the river. The Indians' ways were disrupted, and they began to fight the settlers. Now let's pause and think about what are some ways that the European settlers are interacting with the river that is different than the Nashaway tribe interacted with the river. Okay, they are cutting down the forest at this point to make space and land for what they are needing to progress. Seems like they are impacting the wildlife a bit. I see, are those horses in the background? I think they're cows, maybe. So new animals are interacting with the river. I also noticed it said that they were taking more than they needed of the animals. Now, the rest of this book is going to talk more about the European interaction with the river, and our lesson today is meant to focus more on the Native Americans, how they were impacted by European interaction. But I still want to finish this book and see how the river changes with human interaction involved. The wars raged for many years, but the Indians' bows and arrows were no match against gunpowder, and so the settlers' rifles drove the Indians from their land, pushing them out. Through 100 years of fighting, the Nashua was a healthy river, sometimes dammed for grist and sawmills, but still flowing wild and free. Muskrats, fish, and turtles still swam from bank to bank. Deer still came to drink from the river, and owls, raccoons, and beavers fed there. So now we're 100 years later. At the start of the new century, an industrial revolution came to the Nashaways' banks and rivers. Many new machines were invented. Some spun thread from wool and cotton, others wove thread into cloth. Some machines turned wood to pulp, and others made the pulp into paper. Leftover pulp and dye and fiber was dumped into the Nashua River, which swiftly flowing current washed away the waste. This industrial revolution was a huge turning point because it brought a lot of progress to these European settlers who are now United States citizens. These were times of much excitement, times of progress and invention. Factories along the Nashua River made things of new materials. Telephones and radios and other things were made of plastics. Chemicals and plastic waste were also dumped into the river. Soon the Nashua's fish and wildlife grew sick from this pollution. And this is a true story. Notice how the river looks different from the first picture we saw at the beginning of the book. The paper mills continued to pollute the Nashua's waters. Every day for many decades, pulp was dumped into the Nashua, and as the pulp clogged up the river, it began to run more slowly. As the pulp decomposed, bad smells welled up from the river. People who lived near the river smelled its stench and stayed far from it. Each day as the mills dyed paper red, green, blue, and yellow, the Nashua ran whatever color the paper was dyed. Soon, no fish lived in the river. No birds stopped on their migration. No one could see pebbles shining up through murky water. And that's what it was named after, the pebbles being able to be seen from the bottom. The Nashua was dark and dirty. The Nashua was slowly dying. One night, Oane, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a descendant of Wiowa who still lived by the Nashua, had a dream so vivid that he awoke in a wide-eyed wonder. In his dream, Chief Wiowa's spirit returned to the river and saw it as it was now, still and deadly. Chief Wiowa mourned for the Nashua, but where his tears fell upon the dirty waters, the waters were cleansed until the river once flowed freely. The next morning, Oana went to speak to his friend Marion. When he told her of his dream, she said, "I had this dream also. River with the pebbled bottom is the name Wiowa gave it, but today no pebbles shine up through the Nashua's river waters." Together, they decided something must be done. This is the perfect story to be reading during Earth Day week. Marion traveled to each town along the Nashua. She spoke of the river's history and of her vision to restore it. No longer do we have a river. It's a stinking, smelling sewer, but it wasn't always this way. People listened and imagined a sparkling, never full of fish. People listened and imagined a sparkling river, never full of fish. Whoa, why can I not read that? People listened and imagined a sparkling river, full of fish. They imagined pebbles stirring up through clear waters. They signed petitions and sent letters. They protested to politicians and showed them jars of dirty water. They convinced the paper mills to build a plant to process the waste. They persuaded the factories to stop dumping. Finally, new laws were passed and the factories stopped polluting. You can see a sign over here. Hold your nose, Nashua River. It's probably a sign in protest. Slowly, the Nashua's current began to clean its water. Year by year, the river carried away the dyes and fiber to the ocean. Marion and Oana thanked the people who had helped to clean the Nashua. Through the meadows, towns, and cities, the Nashua once again flows freely. Paper pulp no longer clogs it. Chemicals no longer foul it. Now we walk along its banks and row upon its fragrant waters. We can set our boats upon it with its current, drift. We can set our boats upon it and with its current drift downstream. Once again, the river runs wild through a towering forest greenway. Red-tailed hawks and barred owls live here. Geese pause from their long migration and rest on the riverbanks. Deer come to drink from the river's waters. We too have settled by this river. Pebbles shine up through the clear water. Nashua is what we call it. River with the pebbled bottom. I should have read Nashua at that last part. River with the pebbled bottom. Okay, well, this is the last time I'll be doing one of these videos this late at night. So let's just think about how the river changed and the Native Americans impacted the river and worked with the river, and how the European settlers impacted the river, and how they eventually had to work together to bring it back to the healthy river it once was. The first part of your assignment today will be to complete some reflection questions based on A River Ran Wild. But now I'm going to do some teaching, and with the help of a video, of American history, North American migration between Native American people into North America and European settlers. I don't know why I just blinked there. But I did find this great video on Khan Academy, so I'm going to let them teach part of this. And then when they're done, I will continue my teaching.
About the beginning of American. Often when we think about the beginning of American history, we think 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, or maybe 1492 when Columbus arrived in the Americas. But the history of America really begins about 15,000 years ago, when people first arrived in the Americas. In this video, I want to provide a very brief overview of Native societies before contact to give you an idea of just how diverse and complex these societies were as Native groups adapted to and interacted with their environments. Now, there's recently been a scholarly debate about how people first arrived. We know that maybe 12,000 years ago, during an ice age, the sea level was lower, and so a spit of land in between the Americas and Asia was exposed, over which people may have traveled. But recent archaeological evidence suggests that people were perhaps already in the Americas at the time of this ice age, so it's possible that they may have come earlier in boats. Now, however it was that they arrived, they spread north and south and east throughout the Americas, so that by the time that Europeans arrived in the late 1400s, there were perhaps 50 million people. That's kind of a mid-range number for the estimates that historians have made living in the Americas. And of those, 4 to 6 million were living in North America. So how did these societies develop? Well, a really big moment was around 5000 BCE when people in Mexico domesticated corn, maize as it's also known. And domesticating maize meant that people who had originally been hunters, gatherers, following herds of animals, could partake in settled agriculture. So they could develop villages, complex societies. This isn't to say that they stopped hunting or gathering, but they began staying in one place. So let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at some of the major societies in these regions. Native American societies developed around their natural environments using the resources that were available to them. For example, the Southwest Plains and Great Basin are quite dry. A lot of desert. And so societies in these regions adapted to the dry climate in several ways. For example, Native American groups that lived on the Great Plains continued their hunting and gathering way of life, hunting bison and following the herds of animals in teepees, which were dwellings that were easy to set up and then take down. People in the Southwest, like the ancestral Puebloan people, dealt with this dry environment by creating very complex irrigation projects so that they could water their maize crops, using what little moisture there was. The Puebloans lived in large cave complexes, as agriculture allowed them to grow their population. In the Northwest, fishing in the Pacific Ocean gave Native Americans a plentiful source of food, while farming allowed the Mississippian peoples to develop large settlements like Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, which at its peak may have had as many as 25 to 40,000 residents. The Mississippians and other East Coast Native peoples relied a lot on what's known as three-sister farming, in which people...
All right. Okay, so what the Woman in the Khan Academy video was teaching us was the migration of First Peoples in America, and she was doing a lot of review for what we learned in Lesson 5 about the cultural regions of Native Americans in North America. I like what she said at the very beginning. She said, when we think about history of people in America, we often think about Christopher Columbus first arriving here, or 1776 when the United States was founded. But really, our history in North America begins 15,000 years ago. And if you look here on this First Americans Arrive map, you'll see that land bridge that she was talking about. And she mentioned people migrated across 15,000 years ago and then started dispersing around North America. She also said that we have reason to believe, and there's a bit of a debate, but we have reason to believe that there were already Native American people living here on this land. So it might not have just been, or probably just wasn't, this land bridge here that had people migrating over. There are probably already people living here. So that's a pretty deep history. So I put this map on the right, which refers to all types of movement to the Americas. But really I wanted to show you European movement coming into the East Coast here. I wanted you to see that this is where Europe is located, and we're talking about European settlers coming in here. But if you've got all these push factors of people coming into the United States on this land that is owned by Native Americans, we're going to have to figure out what to do with that land when you get all those people, discussing who's going to have what. So the history and the way of life of Missouri Indians was profoundly affected by newcomers to the area. The indigenous people had occupied the land for thousands of years before the first European explorers arrived. Europeans brought with them new ideas, new customs and traditions, religions, new weapons, and new transport. They brought with them the horse and wheels. They also brought livestock like cattle and sheep, and disease, which profoundly affected the history of Native Americans. In the 1500s, actually, let me go back to this slide. In the 1500s, Spanish explorers introduced Native American way of life to horses, which I just briefly mentioned, but that allowed the woodlands tribes to move into the Great Plains region, and for the Great Plains Native Americans to become more nomadic and able to move around quite a bit more. One prominent tribe in the Great Plains region, and through what we now call Missouri, was the Osage Tribe. This map is showing you the Osage ancestral territory and range that they lived in, and it covers Missouri completely. The Osage were a major player in trade along the Mississippi and played an important role in the founding of St. Louis in 1764. In fact, in 1804, members of the Osage tribe, along with Meriwether Lewis, the explorer from the Lewis and Clark expedition, went to Washington, D.C. to meet with Thomas Jefferson and discuss the expansion into the Louisiana Territory. Let me show you a map of that. So, as European settlers were settling on the East Coast, they started moving in west until they got here to the Mississippi. Now, all land west of the Mississippi in this green space here was part of the Louisiana Territory, owned by France. After the Louisiana Purchase, once the United States purchased this land, the Osage Tribe was seen as a threat to new settlers. The United States government tried to convince the Osage people to give up their land. The U.S. promised 50,000 square miles of land in Oklahoma, which sounds like a lot, and $1,500 cash a year, which is not very much, as well as government protection. And the deal was made, but not all of the promises were kept in the United States' end of the deal. In fact, all of those promises were broken in one way or another. Now let me show you what land they were making a trade for. All of this land traded for this Osage reservation here. Look at the legend. Purple is the Osage reservation. So they traded all of that for land in Oklahoma. Now, in Oklahoma, the Osage tribe still was able to prosper, and they got a hold of some oil, and they ended up being one of the wealthiest tribes in the world. In the 1840s, the biggest threat to tribes in the Great Plains region, which is this whole area up through here, up to Canada, down to the Gulf of Mexico. We talked about that region on lesson 5. But in the 1840s, the biggest threat to the tribes were overlanders, or people who were moving west, just coming through. So not planning on settling here, but moving over to the west side. Okay, so over to, our California region, our Northwest region, Pacific Northwest. They had many conflicts with Native Americans that they came in contact with in the Great Plains region. And there were many battles and wars, and many Native Americans were killed as they passed overland. Here's some pictures of the Osage people. This is an Osage couple in traditional clothing in 1892, Osage women in 1904. So still not modern day, but a little bit closer to our time period. All right, so that's what I wanted to tell you about Native American interaction with European settlers. You're going to read a Newsella article today about Native American culture and Native American interaction with European settlers to further your knowledge on how life changed for Native Americans. If this topic fascinates you, if you want to read more, I feel like I'm trying to cram a lot into a ton of history into this small video. If you have questions, if you would like more research, if you would like more books to read, please reach out to me. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. This is really important history.